Hello again, Joe Yudin here from Touring Israel Luxury Private Tours. Today we have a tour guide. We're going to talk a little bit about King Herod, who he was, and what did he do. So welcome, tour guide Lorne Hubner. Hello, Lauren.
Hi, Joe. How are you? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Hopefully we can see each other in person soon when this coronavirus lockdown is over. So we're going to talk a little bit about King Herod today. What do you got for us?
Okay. Well, when you spoke with me a couple of weeks ago and asked me if I can do this, I was thinking, what would I like to talk about? I mean, there's so many eras in this land, so many as other podcasters on your podcast said, so many layers. You know, you have period of the judges, David and Solomon, First Temple period, the breakup of the kingdom, exile of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Second Temple period, Rome, Byzantine, Muslims, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, British, Land of Israel. Too many to go over. So I thought, what's the most exciting thing for me? It's more or less the Second Temple period. But again, there's so much to go over. I mean, you have the return from Babylon, the rebuilding of the temple. You have Alexander the Great. You have the Romans. You have the Maccabee revolt against Hellenism, which really was probably the first religious war that was ever fought for religious freedom. Mm-hmm. You have the Hasmonean dynasty when we gained our independence again. You have Herod, Hillel, Jesus, Pontius Pilate. I mean, so much. So I thought I would talk a little bit about the time of Herod the Great and some of the building projects that he did. Now, Herod the Great, first of all, why was he called great? Wasn't because he was a great leader. Some people may say he was, but I think there would be a lot of people who also would disagree with that. He was called Herod the Great because of the building projects that he did. And we'll go into that in a few minutes. But first, what I think is really important, and I know what helps me and what helped me when I was learning the material, and what helps, I think, people when I try to guide is to put the things in context, put the history in context. So here we see boundaries of Herod's kingdom, what he was more or less in charge of. He was a client king of Rome, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And I'll come back to this slide when we talk about Caesarea. But what was going on in the land at the time is that Herod was made king or client king of Rome in 37 BCE. But before that, the land enjoyed about 100 years, more or less, of independence under the Hasmoneans. It started with the Maccabee revolt against the Seleucid Empire, the Hellenists, and lasted until 63 BC. So in 63 BC, this was after the king of Alexander Yanai, or Alexander Jannaeus, and after he died, his wife took over, Shlomtzion, or Salome. When she died, her two sons vied for the kingdom, which was Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus. They couldn't decide. There was, I guess, a civil war, you could call it here, and they turned to Rome.
I'm just going to interject for a second. So that in and to itself is very interesting. I mean, you already said you had 100 years of a Maccabean independent kingdom. And the Maccabees, of course, we know from the Hanukkah story, rebelled against Hellenism, rebelled against the Greeks, right, trying to make the Jews good Greeks. And here we have their two sons, Salome's two sons, and their names are Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, two very Greek names. So in the end, the Maccabees had become very Greek and very Hellenist, and something that Judah and Simon and Jonathan, the original Maccabees, frowned upon, and Mattathias, of course, the patriarch of the Maccabees. So what's going on here?
Of course. I mean, you're absolutely right, Joe. And I think they would probably roll in their graves if they saw what happened to their so-called religious revolution. When the Greeks, well, when the Seleucids were in charge here.
Greeks.
Well, Alexander the Great conquered the area, went all the way to Persia, and when he died, he had no successors. So there was a war again, always wars of succession, common through history. So Ptolemy and Seleucid were two of his generals. For the first about 100 years after Alexander the Great died, the land of Israel came under the Ptolemy Empire, which really ruled the area of Egypt up to the land of Israel, to the border of modern-day Syria. In Syria was the Seleucid Empire. In 200 BCE, the Seleucids, again, decisive war up at Banyas, and they took control of the land of Israel.
Right. This is key because the Egyptians couldn't grow good olives in their region. So the closest place for them to get olive oil was Israel. So when the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids, take the land of Israel, or Judea, as it was called at the time, from the Egyptians, from the Ptolemies, that's a big deal. That's taking their oil supply. And of course, olive oil was used for cooking and medicinal purposes, and for weapons and for burning. So this is a big deal between the Egyptian Greeks and the Syrian Greeks, isn't it?
It's a big deal, and it's not only a big deal between the Egyptian Greeks and the Seleucid Greeks. It's a big deal also because at this time, about 200 BCE, the Roman Republic, not yet empire, the Roman Republic is growing in power. And they're looking to see what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. So they're getting a bit concerned also about the growing power of the Seleucids. So after the Seleucids gain control of the land of Israel, one of their kings, Antiochus IV, the famous Antiochus from the Hanukkah story, he has expansionist plans. Up until this time, and the other Seleucids, they're more or less giving the Jews, the Judeans, religious freedom. They're not, as long as you pay your taxes, they're not restricting them at all. But he goes through the land of Israel and tries to invade Egypt. Now, Egypt by this time is under the control or the sponsorship, let's say, of Rome. And again, when you're talking about grain and olive oil and everything, this is the lifeblood of a society. So he gets to Egypt. The Ptolemies, they call Roman emissary, who gives him an ultimatum, puts him in a circle, a circle around him, and tells him, you have, time to decide what you're going to do, but you better decide before you step out of the circle, and you know what the consequences are. So he was really humiliated. He went back to Syria basically with his tail between his legs. And then, because he thought that, or during that time, the Jews, the Judeans, heard rumors that he had died. So they started to sort of rebel against the rule. He got back, heard what's going on, and then he really started his anti-Jewish or anti-Jewish decrees. No Brit Milah, no circumcision for the Jews, no Shabbat, no day of the Sabbath, things like that. So
no Torah study.
Yeah, no Torah study. So things got to a head. Mattathias, the father of Judah the Maccabee, he rebelled against him, and that started the Maccabee War. And like I said, it's probably the first religious war in history.
Right. And then to make a long story short, we have 100 years of freedom here, and then we have what you talked about. The Seleucids come down from Syria, throw out the Ptolemies, and take control of Judea, and basically 100 years later, the Maccabees become very Hellenistic, and Hyrcanus and Aristobulus can't decide who's going to be king. So how is this decision settled?
Yeah, it even happened before that. I mean, as I said, it's Hyrcanus II, because he's named after John Hyrcanus I, who was the king, and they started slowly, much less than 100 years, taking on Greek and Hellenistic customs. So they called in Pompey. But first, let me go back to John Hyrcanus I, because this is important to the story. When the Jews came back from Babylon, and under the Persians, there was the province of Judea. In the first temple period, the southern part of Israel, the Negev, was also part of the land of Israel. But after that, the Jews didn't repopulate there, and it was the land of the Idumeans. So when John Hyrcanus was the king or the high priest, he conquered the Negev and forcibly converted the Idumeans. He basically said, either convert to the Jewish religion, or be killed, or leave. 3 options. a lot converted. And one of the ones who converted is Antipater, who happened to be King Herod's father. Now, it's very important to the story, but we'll get back to that in a minute. So, right, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II had this dispute, turned to Rome. Pompey the Great, the general, came in, took the side of Hyrcanus because he was deemed, I guess, the weaker leader and easier to control, sent Aristobulus to prison in Rome. And since then, up until the Romans left, since Israel was under Roman rule. Now, Rome wasn't the only empire in the region at the time. To the east, you had the Parthians. The Parthians are an empire in, let's say, modern-day Iran and Iraq, successors to the ancient Persian Empire. In 40 BCE, the Parthians invaded westward towards the land of Israel, and Antigonus, who was the grandson of Hyrcanus, no, sorry, he was the son of Aristobulus II, I'm getting confused with it, son of Aristobulus II, he proclaimed himself king, and he took the side of the Parthians. Antipater, Herod's father, he was a key advisor to Hyrcanus II, and Herod followed in his father's footsteps, fought on the side of the Romans, and there was a 3-year war from 40 to 37 BC, where in the end, the Roman side won. Herod got the patronage of Mark Antony at the time, and the Senate voted him to be the king of Judea, a client king. I mean, he didn't have any independence in terms of foreign policy or anything like that. But as long as he ruled the country and paid the taxes and kept the peace, he was in charge of Judea.
Right, which is what he did. Now, King Herod, that's interesting you say that. So Mark Antony makes pretty much through his influence Herod king of Judea. What happens when the whole, we don't have to go through the whole story again, but with Cleopatra and Octavian, who becomes Augustus, what happens when Augustus becomes the emperor, becomes Caesar, and Mark Antony and dies along with Cleopatra?
Yeah, exactly. A very interesting story. So like I say, Mark Antony was Herod's patron. Now, right. After Julius Caesar died, Rome was ruled by a triumvirate. Triumvirate? Yeah, that's the word. So it was 3 leaders. Mark Antony was one, Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's nephew, and the third one, not so important to the story. They were battling. Mark Antony moved to Egypt. He married Cleopatra. Cleopatra had claims on the land of Israel because under the Ptolemy Empire, she was the last Ptolemy queen. Under the Ptolemy Empire, it was under the Ptolemy control. So she was pressuring Mark Antony to give all or parts of it back to her. For instance, the areas near En-Gedi, parts of the Negev. So Herod also, even though he was good friends with Mark Antony, he also had a side note trying to, persuade him against his wife on what he wanted to do. But the battle between Octavian, who later became Augustus Caesar, and Mark Antony came to a head in 31 BCE in the Battle of Actium, which is a big naval battle off the coast of Greece. Now here, Octavian, decisive victory. Mark Antony and Cleopatra went back to Egypt, committed suicide. And now Herod, what does he do?
Yeah, Herod's got a big problem now. Usually when one side gets defeated, the king of the other side cuts everyone's head off who rebelled against him. And Herod was, Herod bet on, well, he was friends with Mark Antony. He was installed as king by Mark Antony. You would assume that Caesar Augustus would now, off with his head. What happens with that?
You're right. Herod bet on the wrong horse. But Herod, as I said earlier, he was called the Great because of his building. Personally, after studying a little bit about him, I think he was also great because of his political savvy and his instinct for survival. So he knew the problem that he was in. He asked for an audience with Octavian. He didn't wait to be summoned. He asked for an audience. He was granted one. It happened in Rhodes. He went, and when Octavian confronted him with this, why shouldn't I cut your head off like I would normally do? He said, look, yes, Mark Antony was my friend. I won't apologize for that. But I am a loyal friend. And now I will be, since you won, I will be your friend. Above all, I'm a friend to Rome, not to one person. And I will be your friend. And if you give me a chance, I will show you how loyal a friend I am. And I guess that hit home, hit a nerve with Octavian, and he said, "Okay, we will give you a chance." Not only did he give him a chance, he expanded his kingdom to the borders that we saw in the map earlier.
Right. And Octavian, of course, now Caesar Augustus, he had a big problem. He was just in this huge war for control of the Roman Empire, and he needed a loyal a client state in the Eastern Mediterranean to act as a buffer, just exactly like you said, against the Parthians and the enemies to the east. So that brings us. So King Herod, if you read the New Testament, he's not a nice figure. And according to the New Testament, he hears that the Messiah has been born. So he calls to kill all of the, I think it was the 2 or 3 year olds, up until 2 or 3 year olds of Jewish boys in the entire kingdom. We don't have evidence of this story in Josephus Flavius, the great Jewish Roman historian, or anywhere else for that matter, in the Talmud or any other writings. But definitely from the Christian side of things, Herod is not a kind figure in history. He's evil, and also up until this point, that the Jews didn't like him at all either. The Jews see him as usurping the Maccabean authority, and that he was an illegitimate king. And later he'll kill most of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, the great Jewish council, and then stack the Sanhedrin with his own cronies for whoever could pay the most. And even in the temple of the high priest, he would give that, which was a family handed down through the family title, job, position. He gives it to the highest bidder, or whoever's his buddy is. He's not a good character to the Jews either. The Jews hate him. The Christians hate him. Caesar Augustus doesn't initially trust him. How does he overcome these problems with the Romans and with the native? There aren't Christians yet. The native Jewish populations.
Wow, you brought up so many points there. I'll try to go through them one by one. So first,
let's start with Caesar. How does he appease Caesar?
Okay, so when he was given the kingdom, now not only Caesar, Herod has the challenge. He has to appease two sides. He has to appease Caesar, but he also has to appease the local Jewish population. Like, as you said, they don't accept him, not only because they see him as a usurper of the Hasmonean dynasty, but also because they don't really consider him Jewish. If you remember what I said before, his father was a forced convert. Now, from what evidence that we have, we see that Caesar, he probably was raised observant, raised as a Jew, but not only was his father a convert, his mother was a Nabatean. So there was a lot of doubt, let me say, if I use a mild word, if he really was Jewish. So to appease the Jews,
at the time, it wasn't clear. It depends which Jewish sect you belong to, whether the Judaism went through your father or your mother.
Right. But still, his father was a convert, so he couldn't trace his lineage back more than one generation. So to appease the Jews, one thing that he did was he married Miriam, that she was the granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, to get some legitimacy from the Hasmonean dynasty. 2, he left Jerusalem more or less as a Jewish city, didn't build any Roman temples there or anything, and actually rebuilt the second temple to one of the grandest buildings of the time. So that's how he appeased the Jews. How did he appease the Romans? Again, by building. He built the city of Caesarea, named after Caesar, which is, if you see on the map, it was a port town at the northernmost point of his kingdom. It was built as a Roman city, A temple to Augustus was built there. It was named after Augustus. He built a port, which was very important because, as we talked about before, all the grain that was coming from Egypt at the time, they didn't have the technology for boats to cross the ocean, so the boats really had to hug the coast. So they would hug the coast up to Caesarea, Dor, and then head to Rome.
So this is, I just want to point out this here we have a picture of Caesarea as it was a few years ago. Caesarea, Caesarea, it's pronounced differently in English and in Hebrew. This is one of the most beautiful places in Israel to visit. It's really a microcosm of the Roman Empire. It's like a little Rome, but on the Mediterranean. It's really a spectacular place to visit. I think it was the New York Times and also Travel and Leisure named it one of the top places to visit in 2020, and
yeah, it was one of the top 10 places in the New York Times, I believe. In this slide, it's an aerial shot of the southern part of Caesarea. You can see the top of the slide, a Roman theater that was built. It was the first Roman theater built in Israel. You can see jutting out on the rocks the remnants of Herod's palace, and you can see to the left a part of the hippodrome where games were held, horse races, gladiator races. One of the interesting things here is that Herod held games here every 4 years in commemoration of the Actium victory of Augustus, and Herod was the first in the history of games to award medals for first, second, and third, for gold medal, silver medal, and bronze medal. He instituted that, which was, I found that was an interesting trivia fact. If we look at the next slide, if we go to it, we can see an artist rendition of how it looked in the time. So here you really see Herod's palace. Towards the end, you see in the middle of this building a swimming pool. So he has this huge palace on the Mediterranean Ocean. It's not enough. He has a swimming pool in the middle. You see the theater as it was then. It held about 5,000 people. And even today, the theater is like the pinnacle place for an Israeli performer. If you get to play in Caesarea, you've made it. And even international stars come here. Joe, if you remember, we saw Foreigner there a few years ago. It was a great concert. I saw a bunch
of concerts there. I saw Morrissey from the Smiths there. I saw Shlomo Artzi, which is he's the one who really made Caesarea once you've played Caesarea, it's really a spectacular venue. And we get all kinds of artists there.
Yeah. So here you see an artist rendition. If we go to the next one, we'll see looking north. This is the Hippodrome. And again, here there were horse races, gladiator games, the seats at the bottom of the screen jut out from Herod's palace. But again, there were seats all around, starting gates to the north. We're looking north, and we're looking north at the harbor. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what the harbor looked like. Again, artist rendition at the time of Caesar. So this was the biggest deep water harbor in the world at this time. And this was an artificial harbor. So breakwaters needed to be built. You see, as we get into the harbor, a temple to Caesar. So again, this is how he appeased Caesar. Now again, keep in mind you have the Jews and the Romans. So the temple here was built, and this is very interesting, to the exact dimensions of the second temple in Jerusalem. So one couldn't take precedence or be more grand than the other. But this was an amazing engineering feat. He called the harbor Sebastus.
How did the local Jews feel about Herod, their king of Judea, building a pagan temple? I think it was of Zeus with Octavian's face on it. How did they feel about that?
Again, he was very politically savvy. Like I say, he rebuilt the second temple in Jerusalem, left Jerusalem alone, left Jerusalem as the land of the Jews. In Caesarea, before he built this, it was a small town from Venetian times called Stratos Tower. There were no Jews living there. So he didn't he was very careful not to encroach on the livelihood of the Jews or to build where it would offend the sensibilities of the Jews. This was a Roman city, a pagan city, but not in traditional Jewish populated areas. So I think that's how he got away with it. But the engineering of building this port was an amazing engineering feat at the time. If you look at the next slide, you see how he did it. He built these rafts that filled them with a concrete mixture using also volcanic ash from Italy, which would harden underwater. So he would move these rafts out to their exact position, fill them with the mixture would be heavy, and sink them, and then they would harden. And this is the way he built this port. At its height, I think 300 ships would be able to enter the outer port. And then there was the inner port, I guess the VIP port, where you can get right up to the steps of the temple. And Marcus Agrippa, one of Augustus's best friends and generals, actually visited here in 15 BCE, a few years before it was completed.
Very interesting.
Here we see, this is an aerial shot of the modern port. So if anyone has been to Caesarea, you see what's jutting out, the breakwater, you see that, and people think, that was the ancient harbor. But no, if you look closely, look at the dark outline in the water. That's the sunken ancient port. So really, it was a lot bigger than even people who visit the site really see. So I thought this was an interesting show.
One of the most incredible things in Caesarea that you can do, especially if you're a scuba diver, is this. What you're looking at here is the first signed underwater national parks in the world, and you can do a scuba tour where they take you down into the ruins that are underneath the sea today, which were once above the sea, and go and see all the ruins of King Herod's harbor under the sea, which is really very, very cool way to do a tour. And also I wanted to ask you about the walls that we see. We see the right angle of walls that go around the city there. What period? Do you know what period that is?
Those are from the Crusader period. After many years, so we're talking about over 1,000 years later than that, after Caesarea has went from a pagan Roman city to a Byzantine Roman Christian city, where the temple that we saw for Augustus was changed into a church. After the Muslims conquested, then finally in the 12th century, the Crusaders conquered it, and they built a wall just around the harbor area of the city. It didn't go as far south as what we saw before, the Hippodrome and the palace and the theater, but Louis IX, who later became Saint Louis, he built the walls here, and they were finally attacked and conquered by the Mamluks in 1265.
Right, and in Caesarea, that's one of the most beautiful things about Caesarea is there are ruins from Phoenician times to through the 19th century, and you can really see everything. And some of the most impressive ruins to see are not only the racetrack, the Hippodrome, or the Roman Bath, or the theater, but the Louis IX's Crusader Gate and the moat that surrounds it with the pre-Gothic architecture, and the gate is really spectacular. So that's Caesarea. Let's talk a little bit about King Herod's Jerusalem. How does he make the Jews like him? What does he do? There we go.
So you see again a rendition of the Second Temple. So First Temple built by King Solomon, destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. 516, the Second Temple is dedicated, but wasn't as grand as the First Temple. I mean, it's a period of 70 years later, so it's even recorded in the Bible that the elders who remembered the First Temple cried when the Second Temple was rededicated. Instead of being happy at this temple, they cried because of its comparison to the First Temple.
It was basically a little wooden shack, but the young men cried in happiness because they never saw Solomon's temple, and at least they had a temple, right?
Right. So that temple stayed for about 500 years, and it was on Mount Moriah. Here you can't see the mountain because of the Temple Mount. So Herod But 500 years later, he did two things. One, he renovated the temple itself, made it grander, but he also expanded the platform on which the temple lay. So you can see, I mean, it's not a great picture, but you can see to the north some buildings. That's Antonia Fortress. That's the northern part of the temple.
With
and
those
the wall,
orange triangles.
yeah. And the walls there, the supporting walls aren't so high. To the southern end, where you see this big arch, where the walls are a lot higher, that's because of the natural topography, because it was on a hill. So the rock outcrop in the north was higher. So
Right.
in the southern part, he made arches and built this platform, about 140,000 square meters, and the length of it is about more than 4 football fields.
Right.
So
It's interesting. I just want to point one thing out. This is a great picture. You said the arch. We call it Robinson's Arch. There's not much left of it, but that whole area, the southwestern corner, there it is. If you look on the bottom right part of this picture, the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, you can see a little outcrop of coming out of the Western Wall. That's part of the Western Wall, and that's where we do our egalitarian bar and bat mitzvahs for Reform and Conservative or non-affiliated Jews who don't want to separate between men and women today.
Yeah, I just guided bat mitzvahs were there just before the coronavirus broke out. They actually had to cut their trip short by 3 days to get a flight home, but
that's too bad. And of course, the Golden Dome of the Rock there is what caps off the summit of Mount Moriah that you were just about to talk about, where the temples used to stand. Correct.
Right. So where we see the Dome of the Rock, that's where the second temple stood. That's where the first temple stood. That's where, according to legend, the supposed sacrifice of Isaac took place, and where the beginning of the world started with Adam and Eve. The foundation stone is right under there. Now, today, all that's left is what you see. So there's nothing left of the temple itself. There's no archaeological evidence. There's the writings of Josephus and other writings. There is one Greek inscription that was discovered there. You can see it in the museum in Istanbul, which was outside the gates of the temple, saying, "Past this gate, no non-Jews are allowed upon pain of death." And why was it in Greek? So that the Gentiles would understand. But we have enough proof and writings, and so there's no doubt that the temple existed. What we call the Western Wall is just a retaining wall of the platform that he built. Why is it so holy? And why not the Southern Wall or the Eastern Wall, which we also have remnants of? Because this was the part that is closest to the temple. So that's why it's holy, because it's the closest place to the temple. But the Southern Wall and the Eastern Wall, the Southern Wall corner with the Western Wall, where you pointed out, Joe, you see a jut of rock, which was Robinson's Arch, which was probably the first interchange in history. You had shops underneath where people could go to buy their pigeons or small goats for sacrifice, where they could change their money. And then you had the stairs to go up, which was one of the entrances to the temple.
Maybe, Jono, you can put that picture that we had on previous to this one. There it is.
Yeah. So here you see the arch. So underneath the arch was a street with shops. Like I said, money changers buying the sacrifice.
Right. That's a really, I love guiding that area, because you see the shop, you see the place where their money changer was. They found a hoard of silver coins there, and there's the mikvahs behind it, the Jewish ritual baths. So is that the place we think that most of the common folk would go up to the temple during the 3 pilgrimages?
They can go up from there. They can also go up, if you see the stairs to the right on the southern wall. There were a triple gate and a double gate there called the Hulda gates. They can go in from there, because just south of there was the city of David, or the lower city, and that's where the common folk more or less would be. Or a lot of pilgrims who would come for the 3 pilgrimage festivals, which was Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot, would camp out on the Mount of Olives, which you also have evidence that in the Gospels that Jesus did in his final week. So they would come up
That's the Mount of Olives on the other side of the white temple there in Mount Scopus.
Yeah.
So the temple is white and the rest of the buildings are beige. What's the difference between them?
The rest of the buildings, it's all built with Jerusalem stone. And I mean, if you've been there, I mean, I know you've been there, but for people who haven't been there, the stones are just, it's amazing, amazing technology. The size of the stones, the way they're quarried, the way they're carved, it's just a sight to see.
Right. Some of the stones are as heavy as a 747.
Yeah. There's also tunnels underneath the Western Wall tunnels where you see the biggest stones, which is quite amazing. The temple is white, as was, and we didn't talk about it in Caesarea, the whole city was white, was plastered. Very, very, very advanced, beautifully white plastered. So also when I guide, like in Caesarea, I try to tell people, imagine this all in white. People thought that at the time, or once thought it was marble, but no, there was no local marble here. So Herod always used local materials, but he had a beautiful plaster finish on these buildings. And here in the temple, it really stands out.
Okay. So let's take a look at some of the other things that King Herod builds. Oh,
okay. This is Masada.
Right.
This is a view from the west, looking east, where we see at the top of the picture the Dead Sea.
What's he doing? Why is he building a fortress? Right, Masada means fortress. Why is he building this huge fortress at probably at immense cost of manpower and money in the middle of the desert?
Okay, so Herod the Great, again, the great builder, built, from what I understand, for three main reasons. One, to appease the Romans, Caesarea. Two, to appease the Jews, Jerusalem. And three, to protect himself if his appeasement didn't work for any of these. So here, he built this to protect himself. There's no evidence that he himself was ever there, which makes it all the more amazing when you see what he built there. But when he was fleeing from Antigonus in the war with the Parthians, he hid his family here. So at least we know his family was here, but we don't know if he was ever here or not. This is a shot from the north looking south, and you can see here, I mean, this is a present day shot. So you see here the northern palace that he built, but in the next shot, I think we have a model of the northern palace on how it was cut out from the mountain. And there's a lot of remains of this, and this is just amazing. I mean, on top of Masada, you have the northern palace, which was set as probably as his residence, and you have a western palace, which was more for official functions. This is probably where his throne room was. This is where he would receive guests if he was there and receiving guests. But this palace, the northern palace, was his residence. Beautiful Roman baths, beautiful frescoes. Just again, the architecture and the engineering, when you think 2,000 years ago, to build something like this carved out of the rocks. And if we go to the next slide, I think I had a picture of frescoes here. This is from the lower part of the northern palace. There's frescoes until today. This is the way you see it. Even the columns, you see behind the fresco how they're not one stone, they're pieces of rock, one on top of the other. But when they put the fresco on, they look really like one-piece columns. Even Josephus, when he writes about Masada, writes that they're columns, which again puts in doubt maybe if he was really there or not. Another interesting story about Masada, which, I mean, it's not the subject of this podcast, but the whole story of the rebellion against the Romans and the suicide of the rebels at Masada. The only evidence, I don't even know if to call it evidence, but the only narrative that we have from that comes from Josephus Flavius. So, again, there's a whole scholarly debate and historical debate what really happened there, but that you can invite me for another podcast and we can talk hours.
Well, we do know that the rebels staged their last battle there and they fought the Romans. And you know what? That's the most important part of the story. Whether you believe in Josephus' account, whether they all killed themselves is a whole nother issue. But yeah, we could talk about that later. What's this?
This I put
Rome.
this is the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, which is where Abraham and Isaac, Sarah are buried. The reason I put this up here is because, again, Herod built this building, and this is one of the only buildings that, or one of the only Herodian buildings that is more or less intact. On the top, you see renovations done by the Ottomans, by the Mamluks, but the building itself is more or less intact. So if you really want to see a Herodian building, not just the remaining walls in Jerusalem or ruins in Caesarea or ruins in Masada, it's worth it to come here to see how the building looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great shot. If you can, everyone knows what the Western Wall looks like, and if you look at this picture, you look at the corner, you can see going up from the bottom, it looks exactly like the Western Wall, and then there's these like columns built into the wall. Right. The Western Wall used to look like that. On top of what's the Western Wall today, there used to be columns like that, which were knocked down by the Romans in the year 70 AD. So this is a great example of what the Temple Mount probably originally looked like after Herod or his son completed that building project. Of course, we can see the minarets that were added at a much later date.
Right. And here, I mean, I've been talking so long about the importance of Herod and his heritage. This I found very real interesting, that in 2011, the Israeli Postal Authority put out a series of stamps dedicated to Herod. So 3 of the 4 stamps here are actually things that I talked about, and you can probably recognize them right away from the slides that I showed: Caesarea, Masada, and the Temple Mount. The third one from the left is Herodian. This is where an artificial mountain that Herod built for himself to be buried in, and this is his tomb. Actually, was found here by archaeologists.
And you know what? For people who've listening to this who've been to Masada before, and you know how spectacular that is, Herodium is even more spectacular. And we've been doing tours to Herodium and to Hebron, to the Cave of the Patriarchs lately as well. Well, Lorne Hubner, tour guide, works for Touring Israel. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I learned a few things I didn't know before. I appreciate that. It was great having you on, and we'll definitely have you back soon.
Pleasure. Would love to. Good to see you, Joe.
Good to see you too. Hopefully we can meet in person soon. Shout out to Jonathan Rose, Wendy Perrin, trusted travel expert for Israel for 2020 and Condé Nast Traveler Specialist.
Hey, Jono.
Subscribe to our webcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out, we've done about 20 of these so far. Check them out. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.